Artisanal Property Rights Development webinar. My name is Jane Dennison, and I'm the Mercury Program Officer. I want to start off by thanking the USAID E3 Land Office for giving us this wonderful opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. What comes into your head when you hear the word artisanal? For me, sitting here in Maryland, I think of a nice, dense, aromatic loaf of bread. For some of you, that might be artisanal beer or maybe handicrafts. But what comes into your head when you hear the term artisanal mining? For some of us, maybe nothing. But it turns out that we actually have artisanal mining in the United States, particularly Colorado, Alaska, and California, but even in Virginia. In fact, our gold rushes were instrumental in the development of our property rights system here in the United States. But for those of you in posts in the developing world, you may be more accustomed to hearing more negative media reports. For example, Human Rights Watch has issued several reports on child labor in artisanal mining. It's also linked to narco trafficking in Colombia, especially with the high price of gold competing with cocaine. Then we have blood diamonds in West Africa, conflict minerals in DRC, and really devastating environmental damage in South America. And of course, money laundering everywhere. So yes, artisanal mining definitely has a bad rep in many countries. It's estimated that there are about 30 to 50 million artisanal miners in 80 mostly developing countries. So let me ask you, why is the Mercury Program Officer moderating a panel on ASM, artisanal small-scale mining? I'd like to talk a little bit about mercury and artisanal small-scale gold mining, not because it is the most important issue associated with ASGM, but because I think it might be a good entree to discuss some of the issues. When we were developing projects to work on the mercury issue, we really were required to get a fuller understanding of all the different issues that are involved in that sector. So just a quick little summary. Mercury is used to dissolve gold from ore. What happens is then the miners, once they get the gold mercury amalgam, they heat it. Sometimes they heat it way out in very remote areas where they're mining, or sometimes they heat it, they have their wives and children heat it over the kitchen fireplace. Through heating it, the mercury is released to the environment, actually into the breathing space of whoever's heating it, and leaving a sponge gold. Once this mercury is released, it can go up into the atmosphere and be transported thousands of miles. About 70% of the mercury deposited in the United States is from global sources. So this was part of the driving force in 2009, the international community started negotiating a legally binding international agreement to protect human health and the environment from mercury, which we now call the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And if you don't know what Minamata disease is, please Google it. So I'm proud to say that the United States was the first country to join this convention. Since then, 34 countries have also ratified. We need a total of 50, and the convention will enter into force, and we anticipate that to happen in 2017. But what's interesting about the convention is that it contains an article devoted exclusively to artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And this makes sense because this sector, ASGM, is the largest source of mercury pollution. But also, the convention has another feature that's quite useful, and this is the requirement for countries that have artisanal gold mining to develop a national action plan. There's a list of elements that are required under this national action plan, but I think it's interesting to note that one of those is a requirement that countries develop an approach to formalizing or regulating the artisanal small-scale gold mining sector. Why is this? Why would an international environmental agreement have such a requirement to bring the sector into the formal economy? It also includes a public health strategy, a strategy on trade of mercury, and strategies for involving stakeholders in the development of this National Action Plan. So it's interesting that the convention essentially takes a development approach to address a chemical pollution issue. And through this, I think that the convention creates a space for countries to acknowledge its issues with the artisanal sectors and to start addressing them in a positive way. So with that, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their sector.
Sorry, Jane, I couldn't hear you just now. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Catherine Picard. I'm an associate here at Tetra Tech. I'm based at our home office in Burlington, Vermont. I'm representing today are the manager and leader of our land tenure and property rights sector, Dr. Mark Freudenberger, who is the project manager of what we call the PRAD project, P-R-A-D-D, which stands for Property Rights and Artisanal Diamond Development. So I'll be speaking mostly about PRAD and artisanal diamonds. I am also the project manager for the capacity building for the Responsible Minerals Trade Project, which is also a USAID funded project that focuses on conflict-free minerals in the DRC. My background, I've been working in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector for about 7 years now. I started working at the State Department in the Bureau of African Affairs, where I focused on conflict diamonds and conflict minerals. And 3 years ago, I joined Tetra Tech and started managing our project in the DRC. Tetra Tech is really, I think, recognized as a thought leader and a major project implementer in the artisanal small-scale mining sector. We've been working in this space for 10 years now. We have been implementing projects in 5 countries, and that is both the PRAD program and the CBRMT program. So those countries are Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Liberia, the Central African Republic, and the DRC. What we bring to those projects and what we offer is kind of a wide set of services, beginning with helping governments and civil society advocates design and implement legal and policy reforms to enable artisanal and small-scale mining to be formalized. We design and implement certification systems and due diligence systems for minerals. That includes helping countries comply with the Kimberley process, which is related to diamonds, as well as systems for conflict minerals, say in the DRC. We do a lot of participatory research and mapping. We use, I would say, some really interesting cutting-edge technologies to help communities identify and clarify and then secure their property rights using GIS technology. And last but not least, we do quite a bit of work in training and capacity building and conflict resolution, helping resolve what I'll talk about later, hopefully, which are kind of the inherent and long-standing tensions between not only customary and statutory rights in mining areas, but more importantly, the tensions between surface and subsurface rights that occur in artisanal mining sites. I'll stop there. I think we'll have an opportunity maybe to talk a little bit more about PRAD in the coming minutes, and I can give an overview of that, or I could do that quickly now, Jane. It's up to you.
Why don't you go ahead, Catherine?
Okay. Just quickly, the PRAD program is really about clarifying and securing property rights at its core. And those are rights that are both surface and subsurface, as I mentioned, as well as customary and statutory. So for example, mining concession might have been given the rights to mine diamonds that are at the subsurface level, but a customary authority, a chief or other local authority may have and want to enforce long-standing rights on the surface. So you inherently have a tension there. But at its core, what PRAD is about is increasing the number of artisanal diamonds that are entering the formal chain of custody. And that's part of our efforts to implement the Kimberley Process Certification System. And we do that by taking a property rights approach. And it's our theory of change, and it's proven to be quite an interesting connection that when you have communities that have clarified and secure property rights, you see more diamonds entering the formal chain of custody. You see governments able to collect revenues and track where those diamonds come from. But from a development perspective, and I think there's probably a lot of development practitioners listening, when you have secure property rights, it also enables miners to, for example, invest in those mine pits after the mining is done. So PRAD, for example, has used mined out diamond pits to create fish ponds and vegetable gardens. And that way supporting our alternative livelihoods, but also really contributing to economic growth and development at the local level. And ultimately, I think from an environmental standpoint, and Jane touched on this, when you have secure tenure, you're much more likely to invest in rehabilitating that land. Perhaps not even just for fish ponds or vegetable gardens, but it actually creates a land market in and of itself. So you can actually transfer those certificates over your land. So it creates a land market, and we have some interesting examples that I can talk about later. But in its essence, that's what PRAD is about, is clarifying and securing those rights from a customary and statutory perspective in order to have those positive development outcomes. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. And I think Catherine did a really good job of talking about the approach that Tetra Tech takes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the development context in the DRC. So my name is Kim Thompson, and I work at the USAID mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I look at our portfolio, looking at trying to create a responsible minerals trade in response to some of the conflict minerals in the DRC, which are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. And I think it's important to discuss a little bit the development context in the DRC, because addressing land rights typically is not an end in itself, but sort of a means to an end. And this certainly is the case for the USAID mission in the DRC. One of the building blocks of our strategy there is to try to create a foundation for durable peace in the eastern part of the country where there is a lot of conflict. And one of the key drivers of conflict in the eastern DRC comes from minerals. And revenues from artisanally mined minerals have been used to finance armed groups as well as rogue elements of the Congolese army. And I think sometimes the narrative is oversimplified, but the role of artisanal minerals in the conflict in eastern DRC is so well known that those minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, are often known shorthand just as conflict minerals and are subject to disclosure requirements under US regulations. So where we come at the problem is trying to break that link between armed groups and minerals, and also trying to just stabilize eastern DRC. And we look at the artisanal mining sector, and specifically at land rights, as a way to get at that larger goal. We've found that insecure and contested land rights and subsurface mineral rights can fuel illicit in the conflict minerals trade. It's also a very large source of local conflicts. In recent years, the DRC government, has encouraged industrial scale mining, which oftentimes happens on the same physical location as traditional artisanal mining. And so that can cause tensions. Also, efforts to even formalize the artisanal mining sector can also cause tensions as well when that comes in the form of taxes and other sorts of things. So I think it's critical to point out right at the beginning that when we're talking about land rights and property rights and the artisanal mining sector, that simply clarifying and formalizing rights is not enough, and that in some cases could even hurt the artisanal miners themselves rather than help them. So where we go about this in our entry point with Tetra Tech under the CBRMT project, the Capacity Building for Responsible Minerals Trade, is really what we're trying to do is help formalize and clarify property rights in ways that will benefit artisanal miners, as well as help a variety of actors create the systems to formalize and legalize the sector, and to take advantage of that and use it as a platform for economic development.
Great, thank you, Kim. Over to Peru, we have Mayna and Claudia.
Okay, good morning. My name is Mayna Martir Torres. I am a climate change and biodiversity conservation specialist working for USAID Peru. I work for the Office of Environments and Sustainable Growth. I joined USAID back in 2013, late 2013, and arrived in Peru early in 2014. And since then, I've been involved in the informal, illegal mining sector. Mm-hmm. My office in particular, we have an environment perspective, and the reason why I've been involved in this issue is mainly because in the Peruvian Amazon, alluvial mining or gold mining using from alluvial deposits is really causing deforestation and contamination of water bodies. And so we've developed a series of activities for many years that are trying to mitigate the impacts. Right now we have a project that is managed by Wake Forest University. It's called CINCIA. It's the Center for Amazonian Scientific Innovation. And so I'm managing that activity, and we focus more on providing information, strengthening scientific capacity, mainly in the Peruvian Amazon, to understand the impacts of alluvial mining and of mercury, which is tightly linked, as Jane mentioned earlier, with gold mining. And I'm here today with my colleague Claudia, and I will let her introduce herself.
Good morning to everybody. I am Claudia Hirsch. I work here at USAID since almost 10 years ago. I am a program officer at the Office of Governance and Institutional Strengthening. I am here this morning because I work in a trafficking in persons activity that has a lot of relation with illegal mining in Peru, and Mayna and I coordinate a lot in those issues.
Thank you, everybody. So I'd like to explore a little bit. Let's stick with Peru. First of all, I'm interested in learning a little bit more about the formalization process in Peru, and why it's so important, why the government school is important, why it's so difficult, and what are the obstacles.
I'm sorry, Jane, can you repeat the question?
Sorry. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the formalization process in Peru and why it's important, what the government perspective is, and what are the obstacles that you see in that process.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we can share the answer to that question. So in Peru, distinguishing between what is artisanal, what is a small scale, medium scale, large scale, is something that gets a little blurry, especially when it comes to artisanal small scale and medium scale. There are laws, existing laws that clearly define what are the different specifications or technical specifications for the different types of mining. And it's part of those laws that also created a formalization process a few years ago. Right now in Peru, what happened is that the government opened the opportunity for miners to sign a declaration of intent to become formal. And with that opening, miners had to go through a process so that they could actually be given the permits or become formal. So that process is actually supposed to expire by the end of this year, in a few weeks. So right now, the new administration in Peru, we had an election this year. Now we have a new president, and they have committed to revisiting the existing regulations, and hopefully either before the end of the year or early in 2017, there should be an updated formalization process. If this process is allowed to expire without any new guidance from the government, then the risk would be that those miners that are now considered to be informal will be illegal. So they shouldn't, in theory, not be able to operate. Most likely, the reality is that things will continue until there's new guidance. But the formalization process is one that has been challenging to implement. In Peru is a very diverse country. We have the coast, we have the highlands, the Andes, and then we have the Amazon. What we've known is that about 70,000 miners sign up to be part of that formalization process. And Claudia, you can correct me.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's the number.
That's a number. Yeah.
That's a number that we sort of we know.
Mm-hmm.
But of those, only a handful were able to actually complete the process, and those who were are miners that have operations in the highlands, where it's more of the hard rock mining. The miners that are operating in the Amazon, their type of mineral deposit is different. It's alluvial, and with that comes other challenging, more technical challenges for those miners to be able to complete the formalization process. That linked to issues with political will at the local, regional level, have really, in my opinion, prevented any miner from becoming formal in the Peruvian Amazon. So right now we are all kind of waiting to see what the new new changes to the regulation are going to be, and hopefully it will be something that will help bring bring more miners into formalization process.
Great, thank you. Just to dig into that a little bit further, so you mentioned that only a handful of miners were able to be formalized. That's also true in hard rock areas. Can you hear me? Also true in hard rock areas. Yeah. So, can you hear me?
Not really.
No.
No.
Uh-oh. Catherine and Kim, if you can hear me, maybe I'll go over to particularly Kim. I'd be interested in, you mentioned that you were trying to work with formalization in a way that benefits the miners. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that means as far as the programming.
Sure. Do you want me to go first or Kim?
Yeah, Catherine, please.
Okay. I'll speak to some of the goals and interesting outcomes we've had related to formalization broadly and specifically. I think the benefits of clarifying and securing tenure rights related to artisanal diamond mining. I think at a meta level, it's very much related to sort of large development goals. Those are economic growth, good governance, peace building. But intrinsically, I think the two have been related for a long time: property rights and mining, and the formalization of that. If you think back to the gold rush, as you mentioned, and the work by John Steinbeck and Tortilla Flat, all the way to blood diamonds. At its core, those are about people trying to access resources and secure access to those resources. And so a great deal of conflict around resources is, in our view, rooted in a lack of security and clarity around property rights over mineral resources. So what do? We know from the PRAD program that there are a number of really positive outcomes that have come from formalization and specifically clarifying and securing those property rights. Number one is reduced conflict. When miners can defend their claims to a diamond mining pit or a gold pit, they can ward off predatory actors, whether that's the state, whether that's a militia group, or other predatory actors. If they have a piece of paper that is recognized by the state as well as the community, and the two are important, it helps fend off those predatory actors, and it helps reduce conflict between miners who are competing for access to say a certain pit. And we have some interesting data, I think, most notably in CAR, in Central African Republic, where we did work to clarify those rights. We saw a decrease in diamond-related conflicts between communities drop in just 1 year from 142 conflicts to 2. And those are conflicts that are recorded and go before a local judicial system to be resolved. So I think that's sort of an interesting indicator. The second is very much in the spirit of why PRAD was funded and why CBRMT was funded, which is to get more minerals into a legal chain. And part of that is through a formalization process. So if you don't have secure tenure and you're a miner, you're much more likely to mine very quickly, to select a site very quickly, and then rapidly move on. You're more likely to sell your diamonds and your gold in the informal market because you have no security over the site you're working at. So we've seen that when you clarify those rights, you get literally more diamonds and more gold flowing through legal systems. That creates revenue for the state, legal revenue. It also enables us to track where those diamonds came from or where that gold came from, which is very important to end users on the international market. And an interesting piece, I think, is when you clarify those rights and secure them, the communities themselves start policing and enforcing either rules that are customary over who has access to resources, who can tax, who can't tax. But it doesn't require the state or an outside intervention coming in to police and enforce rules, because a community and individuals who have tenure will enforce those rules themselves. So it's a very sustainable approach in that sense. And then the last two big, I think, positive outcomes of formalization and clarification of rights are, I spoke about earlier, rehabilitating those landscapes. You are, if you own that pit, much more interested in filling it up and stocking it with fish. Or women, in the case of in Cote d'Ivoire and other places in West Africa, have planted vegetable gardens and created alternative incomes once those pits have been long ago abandoned. We see in Cote d'Ivoire a transition towards cashew nuts, for example, in a lot of old diamond mining areas. So with secure tenure comes those opportunities for alternative livelihoods and economic development. I think that's important. So there's just some good examples of why we focus on property rights, from conflict, economic development, to rehabilitation of landscapes.
Great. Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Catherine, of course, did a wonderful job of covering it. I'll add a few examples just from the DRC, which really just builds off of what Catherine already spoke about. In the DRC, we've created these conflict-free supply chains. It's one of the things that USAID has helped to finance, both through a number of different instruments, one of them being the one with Tetra Tech, another one being working with the International Organization for Migration. And the benefits that we see from those conflict-free supply chains are just that because they're formal and because they are not being taxed by armed groups or others than what we see. Actually, the UN group of experts this year wrote a report. They write a report on Eastern Congo every year, and this year one of their conclusions in the report was that armed groups have actually moved significantly out of what we call the 3T minerals, tin, tantalum, and tungsten, largely because the sector is more formalized. There are these conflict-free supply chains, and some of the armed groups have moved out of that sector. So for us, that's a big win. We see that as contributing to peace and security in Eastern DRC, safer for communities, safer for the area writ large. And so that's sort of on a macro scale. On a very micro scale, and one of the ways that we can make sure that the structures are working for miners, which I think that was one of your questions, is the CBRMT program works with cooperatives. So under DRC law, in order for miners, artisanal miners to be formalized, they have to be formalized in a cooperative. However, the cooperative structure it really is on the ground. It's essentially a top-down. It's one person that sort of it doesn't work like a cooperative. And so one of the interventions that CBRMT has taken is trying to work with cooperatives to make them actually function for the benefit of miners.
Thank you, Kim. That's fascinating. So some of the negative press that we see has to do with the small scale or artisanal miners protesting on the concessions of the large scale mining companies. How can large scale mining companies best partner with the artisanal miners on these issues? Kim, what do you think?
Yeah, so you raise an interesting question, and it's a difficult issue because there often is conflicting customary rights versus legal or statutory rights. So for instance, in the DRC recently, there's been a move to encourage industrial scale mining, and that has on some cases come at the expense of the artisanal miners who are mining informally in the same area, and that leads to conflicts. And it's always going to be a tricky issue, but I think there are ways to partner with large scale mining companies because it's in the best interest of everyone to try to reduce that conflict. It's a significant risk to industrial scale mining companies as well. So a couple of things that we have done through the CBRMT program and through other programs is to try to create areas, legal spaces where artisanal miners can have formal rights right outside of the concession, right along the border of the concession of an industrial mining company. And then where the mining company can help out are in areas such as providing some technical assistance in terms of making sure that the mineral base there would actually support artisanal mining. That there is a livelihood to be made there by helping out with equipment and other things like that. So I think there are creative ways to help reduce potential conflicts that happen between industrial scale and artisanal mining.
Great, thanks for that. Peru, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Jane, if I can just complement, just to elaborate a little bit more from the Peru perspective, this interaction between the formal large-scale miners and the artisanal small-scale miners, it's a little bit challenging given the context in Peru, since yes, there might be informal miners are operating on the margins of a large-scale concession. But then the majority of the gold that is being mined by informal miners is there's no overlap between, it's in a different geographic location as the large-scale mining companies. So, for example, in the case of Madre de Dios, which is a region in the Amazon, there's no large-scale mining operation happening. So you don't see that. It's hard to find an opportunity for these miners to work with the large-scale private sector. But in the highlands, there might be opportunities. We're not familiar with those cases being successful yet, but there could be good opportunities.
Yeah, but the majority of the big mining and the formal ones work in the highlands. Less in the jungle or in the Amazon area.
Great, thanks for that. Sticking with Peru, Mina and Claudia, can you talk a little bit about the connection between artisanal mining and issues including trafficking persons, money laundering, links to narco trafficking, and how USAID and the government is addressing artisanal mining?
Yeah, so yes, definitely here in Peru, we've learned that there are different connections between illegal mining and other criminal activities, trafficking in persons, money laundering. Part of the approach we've taken, not just as USAID, but as an embassy, is coordinate with the other sections, because it's definitely an issue that goes beyond the Environment Office. So we do try, we do have a working group. We try to exchange information so that all of the sections are aware of what each other is doing when it comes to illegal mining or informal mining. So since we do have Claudia here, who's an expert on trafficking in persons, I will let her elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I wanted to, not just to add to Mina's comments, illegal gold mining started to increase a lot in the past years because, of course, the prices of the gold and the lack of state presence, especially in the Amazon areas. And since that happened, we noticed that there was also an increase on the number of victims of trafficking in persons. We have some numbers from the public ministry, some official numbers from the police, and those numbers have been also increasing. That's why we, here in the embassy, in connection with the State Department, started to support trafficking in persons activity. And we're doing that since 2 or 3 years ago. We are working with a local NGO, a very well-known local NGO that is providing support to government of Peru officials. For example, we are working with prosecutors, especially in the Amazon areas, so they are more and better prepared to prosecute, to investigate cases of trafficking. We are also working in the prevention area with other smaller local organizations, also in the Amazon areas, to make awareness about trafficking in persons and how girls are being captured and taken to this areas that they are very difficult to access. Once a girl or a boy are taken into these areas, they are very remote areas and hard to get there. And we are also working in the protection issues. We are supporting 2 shelters that operate in the jungle areas also, because when there are this interdiction operativos, in the areas, victims are being rescued, and there were no place to take them and to attend them. So we provide support to the shelters, and we train the staff there so they can give legal and psychological services to the victims.
Great, thank you, Mina and Claudia. I'd like to turn to a different angle. And to do that, I'm just going to describe really briefly a project that the State Department did in Burkina Faso, where we introduced mercury-free processing equipment. And so we basically took from getting about 30% recovery of the gold. So they were losing 70%. And then with the mercury-free processing, we took them from going from 30% to 75%. So a huge increase. And, I think this is really promising for, potential replication and sustainability of that kind of activity. And possibly an entree for the private sector to be involved. But it's not always that, straightforward. And I wondered if any of our panelists had some thoughts on involving the private sector. And maybe we could start with Kim.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very good question, and I think that the role of the private sector cannot be underestimated when we're dealing with supply chains. We need the buyers and the end users to be interested in and engaged in buying the minerals. And for the minerals coming out of DRC, this is a particularly important issue, since companies, U.S. traded companies do have to have disclosure. They're subject to disclosure rules. So we do have inherently, I think, some more interest on the private sector side to be engaged because of the disclosure requirements. But what we have found is that we have a platform. It's called the Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade. And what that does is it's been quite powerful. It brings together members of the private sector that are buying the minerals, such as Apple and Intel, Motorola, companies like that, with NGOs that are concerned about conflict minerals coming from the Great Lakes region, and as well as government entities. And what that does is it provides sort of a safe space to talk about difficult issues and to try to create a solution. And also what it does is it keeps the private sector engaged in the issues and comfortable with the quality of due diligence that's happening, with political updates on what's happening in the region, whatever it is that is of a concern from a reputational standpoint from the private sector. It gives a platform to sort of safely talk about that. And certainly, the conflict-free supply chain simply wouldn't work without the private sector buying in and specifically buying those minerals that are certified as conflict-free over other minerals. So the private sector, I think the role cannot be ignored. That the private sector is a very, very important partner.
I'm happy to add a couple words. I definitely echo what Kim said about the critical importance of the private sector. I think what the private sector can, and in some cases has done, is really been at the forefront of thinking innovatively and investing innovatively in pilot projects, and being willing to learn from those pilot projects about what works and what doesn't work, and how to harvest those lessons and adapt. I think mercury reduction is a great example of where the private sector can make a small investment that can be scaled up if successful. And we've seen some private sector actors really step in and support those initiatives. I think a second piece that I'll just comment on is private sector engagement in country is also critical, because it sends this important signal to people on the ground, to governments, to traders, to cooperatives, that the private sector remains engaged and remains interested in finding innovative solutions to a whole host of problems, whether it be child labor, mercury, environmental impacts, health and safety, or just certification. But sending that signal is critical, because that signal needs to be heard in order for things to change on the ground. And without that connection, without that engagement, you lose that connection and that communication aspect. And so I really, I've been grateful for, in the case of CBRMT, we've had a number of very forward-thinking private sector actors become engaged in the process. And I know in the diamond sector, the Responsible Jewelry Council and others have really been engaged in the Kimberley process and other initiatives to demonstrate their role in the supply chain. So it doesn't stop when the minerals leave the country. It's about connecting all those aspects of the supply chain.
Great, thank you both. I think we'd like to go to questions from our audience. So I'll read out the first one. It's directed to any of you panelists who would like to take it on. Does anyone have experience with indigenous communities that oppose individual land rights because they want to maintain collective control over their land? If so, what strategies can be used to respect cultural traditions of collective control while providing the benefits of individual land tenure? This is asked because in some communities, this issue has caused considerable conflict. Any volunteers? Peru, maybe?
Yeah, so to our understanding here in Peru, the indigenous communities still have the communal rights. So the title to the land belongs to the entire community. I am not familiar with that balance between the communal versus the private owner rights and how the community decides. In my short experience dealing with indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon, usually it is the APU or the president of the community along with a council who make the decisions about what are the activities that take place and then how the resources are shared. But when it comes to this issue and mining, I don't think we have an example right now. We do know of invasions to communities, and this being a very sensitive topic. So I don't know.
Because just to add on, because the community lands are to stay within for the community so they do their activities, what they usually do. So if somebody individually comes, it's considered an invasion, and that would cause a conflict. But it's not that the government or a claim will take place individually in a community area.
Great, thank you. Kim or Catherine, any further comments on that?
I think it's less about, in our case, at least in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's less about indigenous as much as it is about this tension between individual and collective access or trying to clarify those rights. And I think that the specific question is, what strategies can be used to respect the cultural traditions while providing the benefits of the individual system. And I think, first of all, what we've learned is it takes an enormous amount of time to rectify and resolve the tensions between customary and statutory systems of tenure. And that speaks to the ability of communities to collectively enforce what resources or land that they're trying to defend and have that recognized by the state. That said, when you do address those tensions, which are often sort of latent and historical, the payoff is quite large. There are a number of ways of doing that, strategies which can involve technologies such as participatory mapping and using GIS to layer over different claims and types of claims, and doing it in a participatory manner where you get buy-in from authorities as well as traditional leaders. I think another example is in the DRC, you have traditional leaders who are exerting authority based on a traditional claim that this is my traditional land and therefore I should be able to tax various people mining on that land. But in essence, it's for personal gain. So it's almost flipping your question on its head of when traditional authorities exert their rights to their own personal gain. And so a lot of work we do is trying to resolve those tensions between traditional authorities and communities or cooperative members of who has rights to what, and how we can create a space that advances economic development and peace building around minerals rather than fighting those battles over who has access. But it requires incentives. I think that's the biggest strategy. There's no gold bullet. It's contextual. What works in Cote d'Ivoire does not work in DRC, and I'm sure would not work in Peru. But I think that we can really learn these interesting lessons from each other of what works and why. And at their core, what I've seen is incentives. Why should these people, these stakeholders, come to the table? What's incentivizing them to negotiate their rights and access to resources? And you have to have that carrot. In Cote d'Ivoire, that might be the ability to rehabilitate land and to use it for cashews or vegetable gardens or whatnot. In the DRC, it's about accessing international markets, because you need to have those property rights clarified if there's going to be a certification system. And with no certification system, you can't sell in the international market and get the spot price that you're hoping for. So our carrots are different around the world, but I think we have to come at it from the perspective of the stakeholders, of what's going to bring them to the table. And it takes time. It definitely takes time, but like I said, the payoff is often very worth the effort.
Great, thanks, Catherine. We have a question from Twitter. Any plans to expand PRAD type approaches to gold? This could be transformative to artisanal mining. Maybe that's best for Kim. Would you like to take a stab?
Sure. I mean, the PRAD type of approaches to gold, I'm assuming that means the one that's taking into account the land tenure and property rights. And we are doing something sort of a PRAD type approach, I guess you could call it, to trying to pilot gold traceability in the DRC through the CBRMT project. And Catherine, of course, can speak to this too. But for gold, I'm trying to think of what I want to say about gold. For gold, it's definitely a very different mineral than diamonds, and it poses all sorts of unique challenges. And it can't. In the lessons, some of the lessons can be applied to the DRC context and gold in the DRC specifically, but certainly not all. And so it's, I think we are trying to learn from those types of larger lessons, and certainly that's the point of this webinar as well, is to learn from each other. But really, I think there's also, it's important to understand that the context is very important, and gold in the DRC is going to be inherently different and need a different approach. And I think it's important to point out that one of the things that is very clear is that the approach, even in the DRC, to tin, tantalum, and tungsten does not work for gold. So even in the same context, gold is different than the 3Ts, and it'll be different from diamonds, and that there are some general lessons that can be applied, but you really have to work with that supply chain and figure out who the actors on that particular supply chain are, and what, as Catherine said, what are their incentives, and how can we change the incentives to create an outcome that we want to see. So that's how I would say that we're sort of using the lessons, but then applying them to quite a different context.
Great, thanks, Kim. Some interesting remarks there. Another comment from Twitter. I really admired the work of the PRAD. Any evidence of better environmental performance in mining?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, any evidence connecting land rights to better environmental performance in artisanal mining?
Yeah, definitely. There is some good evidence, and I know we'll have an opportunity to answer questions on a blog format afterwards, and I'm happy to give more detail so I can really look into it. But certainly we know, for example, in under the PRAD project, I think over 700 mining sites were rehabilitated just with the technical assistance of PRAD, and that involves refilling diamond pits and either planting tree crops like cashews or other trees that can be used for forestry, as well as planting vegetable gardens and whatnot. I think the rehabilitation of landscapes is difficult in mining areas, but it's critical, particularly, and I think Peru touched on this, in alluvial sites, because where a lot of diamond mining occurs is in these floodplains, in these alluvial floodplains, which have enormous value for growing rice or growing other cash crops or subsistence crops. So the ability to rehabilitate is critical. And PRAD does have a number of success stories in being able to take a pretty degraded landscape, in the case of diamond mining, and really transforming that not only for environmental reasons and outcomes, but as I mentioned, for alternative livelihoods. And the two coming together, I think, is an interesting example. Gold mining is harder. And so is the 3Ts, and Kim can comment on that. They're not always in alluvial spots, and often we see that those mines are worked for much longer periods of time than a diamond mine might be. When people find a diamond pipe, they tend to follow that pipe, and when it stops producing, they move on. Where gold mining can often kind of spread out and have pretty deleterious effects on the environment. Not including, certainly not forgetting the impact of mercury and what that does to a watershed. PRAD does not work on mercury because they're focused on diamonds. It's certainly something we are interested in CBRMT of how to address that, and from a progressive standpoint, understanding that you can't eliminate mercury right away. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to give some more specific examples afterwards on outputs from rehabilitation on PRAD.
Thanks. And I guess I can't believe it's time when we're supposed to wrap up now. This has been a very rich discussion, I think, on illustrating the breadth of issues that touch artisanal mining, the challenges and potential solutions, some successes. Of course, we see, there's a lot of similarities across the various commodities, diamonds, the 3Ts, and gold, but there are also some specific challenges, and every country and region has its own specific factors that will influence the programming. I hope that, I've been a big fan of the PRAD project for a long time, and the fundamental importance of property rights in promoting environmental stewardship, easing the path to becoming part of the formal economic sector, reducing conflict, reducing corruption. I think it's really critical. And we didn't get into it too much, but also the critical role of the government across the ministries. And we're talking about mercury, of course, it's the Ministry of Health, Environment, Mining, and others. We touched a bit on the role of the private sector, and I like the way Kim mentioned that it provides a safe space for these various potential partners to work together. So I want to thank again USAID E3 Land Office for enabling us to have this discussion. Thank the panelists